We missed 203, but it was an intense day, quite an insightful day, and no surprises here. Left me with something that I think is a worthy theme for the 5 minutes or so that I have with you this morning. That is the absolute, undeniable, unrelinquished power of unstructured conversation. And both parts of that theme, both words used to encapsulate that theme, are equally important as part of the whole. Unstructured, meaning not to have a planned list of questions in advance, not to have anything more than the theme, the subject matter with which to start, if that, not having an agreed list of things you can and cannot speak about. Unstructured as in building it from the ground up, not starting with a blueprint. And conversation, there's a rabbit hole we could go down. I think I've spoken about this on previous days, but trying very much to stick to this unscripted nature of the podcast. I'm not looking back to see if I have spoken about it. Maybe if you come forward for one of our Q&A episodes, you can correct me where I'm wrong. But anyway, conversation, at the very least, I remember it's something that I've written about in terms of having genuine conversation, which involves, among other things, knowing when to listen and when to stop just waiting to fire that contribution that you've had and trigger since someone else started to speak. Not simply waiting for them to stop speaking so that you can add that new contribution. Conversation meaning go with the flow, listen to what someone else is saying, be open to having no idea how to respond, to say you don't know, to go with the flow, whereby you might start thinking that you're absolutely 100% correct on a particular issue or a direction to take, a plan to crystallise, but then have something come up in conversation that makes you realise you're wrong. To be able to say you're wrong and then go with that new flow is part of conversation. I'm reminded actually of a wonderful TED talk from a number of years ago now. It might be about 4 or 5 years old at this point, but it's still opposite and very much one for contemporary times. And that was from Celeste Headley, I believe, who spoke on different ways of having better conversation. I won't remember all of them, but one of them was to indeed go with the flow, not to stick too closely to structure, but to wander through whatever comes up in conversation, having genuinely listened. And that point on listening was another point Celeste had made in this TED Talk, where it isn't all about you just waiting to speak, but genuinely listen to the response, to ask open questions so that you get the most genuine and interesting responses. I've definitely mentioned on previous days, when you're thinking about how to understand the problems of someone you might want to collaborate with or help, ask the open-ended questions, the whys, the hows, the whats, rather than something that would lead them to a yes or no, or to simply agree with a statement that you've put forward in a leading question. To be also in the moment, which I think encapsulates several of the previous recommendations for a good conversation. To not be scrolling through your phone, to not be checking the time, to looking over your shoulder at who else is around, but to be there with that person or the small group of people that you're speaking to, and be focused entirely on the act of that conversation. And going back to the two-word theme here, unstructured conversation, should demand your full attention because it's unstructured nature. It's the chaotic cadences that are ever changing, ever growing, ever twisting and turning in ways you can't expect should demand your full attention to get the most out of that conversation in the most productive manner. And so this is what came up for our team yesterday, where I'm delighted to say that rather than sitting through the two-dimensional virtual mind melt that is a Zoom call, we actually managed to get together and go for lunch. And that conversation over lunch began with me setting the theme, we were talking about a paper that we'd been invited to write, roughly what the theme of that would be, and me saying a little bit of the history about how this came to be and what the value of the output of a project like that might be. And that was it, that was the seed planted, but the rest of the conversation was to explore how we might go about that project, what we might actually bring to it, what technology we might reveal in that project, what applications we might exemplify the technology with. The plan going into that conversation wasn't concrete, it wasn't set in stone. I didn't have a bullet point list, but we did have a feeling that we were looking to get to some sort of more niche plan, more focused plan with which to go forward, with which to delegate particular tasks so that everyone around that table, as part of that unstructured conversation, would go away with some structured insight on how to proceed. But the wonderful thing about all of that was so much happened that I just simply wasn't expecting. There was several times where it was made clear to me that I wasn't being transparent enough or wasn't being clear in what I was trying to put across. There was ways going into that conversation, walking from the office to the restaurant, that I thought, this is nailed, this is dead on right. But then as that conversation flowed with myself and my team, perspectives and points of view came in that made me realise and say out loud the purpose of that conversation. Oh, damn, I'm actually very wrong about that. In fact, to continue going this way, I would actually be a hypocrite of something else that you've reminded me that I've said in the past. Let's go with the flow. Let's go with what you've just helped highlight for me. And now that I'm saying all of this out loud, I think this is rather serendipitously, but perhaps for some subconscious reason linking to what I've said in very recent episodes about criticism, taking that on board, not letting criticism die with its negative connotations, but seeing it for the constructive force for good that it can be. And unstructured conversations, like the example I'm describing, are an excellent forum with which to practice taking criticism on board and going with it rather than sticking to some sort of benign, rigid, inflexible schedule that you might have had in mind going into that conversation. So out of the end of that, what's the end of that example? What's the outcome for us? We know what we want to study. We know what we want to put into this paper. We know how to go forward now. We didn't have that prescribed going into the conversation. We didn't have the surprises of that conversation that we couldn't possibly have predicted. That ultimately turned out to be what we needed to bring that plan to where it is now. We're starting to delegate tasks. We're agreeing on what not to put in a paper like this one. And we know what we want the story to be. We've got a project space that's separate from everything else. We're starting to get from the broad, messy, beautifully unstructured conversation down into a pointed plan that couldn't have come about any other way, and to get all of these people in the room looking at the blacks of each other's eyes and talking the way that we humans are evolved to do. Where and when could you benefit most from an unplanned, unstructured, genuine, flowing conversation. Thanks as always for being here. I'll see you soon for another episode of the We Dreamed podcast. Have a great one.
If you like what you're hearing on the podcast, head over to the website where not only will you find the written blog versions of these podcasts, you'll find my leadership blog series, the Daily Thought series, and information about my book on managing the imposter phenomenon. We also have even more free resources and webinars linked to the YouTube channel. So head on over to dr-marc-reid.com. That's dr-marc with a C -reid.com